over in the back. Nolan, why don't you tell me one of the things you wrote? Could be a similarity or a difference. Photosynthesis happens in autotrophs, and what does cellular respiration happen in? Heterotrophs, and let's not forget autotrophs as well. That's a thing that people often forget. Plants do cellular respiration. They also do photosynthesis. So that's a big distinction. Who else is going to share with me? Megan, you have to go, so why don't you share and then go? Dang it. Photosynthesis requires light. And cell respiration does not require light. That is an excellent point to make. It's one, you can go. It's 102 actually. Sure. Let's hear from over here. Alyssa, why don't you tell me one of the things you wrote? Which kind of, in they both. Okay, so both of them have ATP. Let's not forget, because usually once we get to the end of cell respiration, people say, oh yeah, the whole point of cell respiration is to make ATP for my body. Of course, cell respiration makes ATP. But don't forget, ATP is produced in both reactions. So I'm going to add the word produced. In photosynthesis, you don't notice it at the end because it gets produced and then used up, but it's definitely there. Seth, let's hear one of the things you wrote. Photosynthesis produces sugar, and I'm going to add the other product so I can write them at the same time. So photosynthesis produces sugar as well as oxygen. Cellular respiration, what does it produce then? And I'm going to add water as well, just so we don't forget about it. So photosynthesis and cell respiration have different products, and sort of along the same line, they have different reactants. So let's not forget, photosynthesis uses CO2 and water. Cell respiration uses glucose and oxygen. So it's the same substances, but they're in the opposite order. So you might have put in the both category just the idea of which substances are part of the reaction. They're not in the same order, but it's the same stuff that's there. Now those are a lot of the basic, I think, main things that people would say. Would anyone like to volunteer some other things that they have written, especially for the both category? Does anyone have something else in the both category? So I'm going to add something in the both category. Oxidation, reduction. Those are reactions that happen in photosynthesis and cell respiration. Oxidation kind of can't happen without reduction, or vice versa. Remember, oxidation is losing something, reduction is gaining something. So if something is going to gain something, something else has to lose it. And that happens in both reactions. The other thing that I want to add is along the lines of ATP. This is called chemiosmosis when ATP is produced. So if any of you wrote chemiosmosis, I saw at least a couple people wrote that. You are correct. That process happens in both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. The other thing that could theoretically go in the both category, we already wrote it, but let's just highlight autotrophs. Autotrophs can do both of these things. The other thing that could go in here is sort of something about when it happens. We already mentioned that one requires light, one does not require light. Both of these processes could happen during the day. Photosynthesis kind of has to happen during the day because it requires sunlight, but cell respiration could also happen during the day. Does anyone else want to add anything to either the similarities or the differences? Maybe that's not up here. So these are the big major things that are the same and that are different between photosynthesis and cell respiration. So if you could check, did you have 3 similarities? Did you have 3 differences? It's out of 3 for each of them, making it out of 6 altogether. So I'm just going to remind everybody that we're talking about the first part of photosynthesis, the light reaction. It can also be called photolysis. Photo is a prefix that means light. Lysis, like we've already seen, means to break something apart. In particular, I'm going to remind you that a molecule of water is getting broken apart. So photolysis is really specifically talking about this molecule of water that's being split. We can also call this the light-dependent reaction because it depends on light. This is the part that sunlight is required for. Now, like we saw yesterday, and I'm just going to back up one screen for a second. This was the screen that came before where I summarized where the 2 parts happen. This reaction happens in the thylakoid membranes. So if I'm looking at a chloroplast, and there are these flattened pancake-looking type things, those are the thylakoid membranes. And yesterday I showed you a little animation that did a much better job of illustrating this than I could ever do by drawing it, that showed you that on each of those membranes are a bunch of little structures, and those are the structures that are going to help carry out photosynthesis. So what's actually happening? Well, first of all, light is absorbed by chlorophyll. So like I mentioned yesterday, chlorophyll is a pigment. Pigments are the things that give color. And you might recall us talking about how chlorophyll does not absorb green light, and that's why things look green. Now, chlorophyll is a pigment, and when you have a whole bunch of chlorophyll in a cluster, it's called a photosystem. So as a really crude representation of what you saw yesterday, if I was to look at the top of a photosystem, there's sort of a central piece, and there are a bunch of little chlorophylls around it. That's more or less what a photosystem looks like. So if I'm looking at it from the top, I got one thing in the center and a bunch of little chlorophylls around it. Now, when light is absorbed, electrons are released, or we also said we could use the word excited. So what happened, electrons, 2 of them, started moving around until they got to that central part of the photosystem. Once they got there, they started to move around. And I told you when we watched the animation, I wasn't going to be concerned with you knowing the names of all of the molecules that carried the electrons around. But once the electrons get to this central part, there are carriers. They have names. We're not going to focus on them. It's beyond the scope of our course. But the idea is that those electrons are going to leave photosystem 1. They're going to move away. And they're going to move along down a chain. Now, eventually, these released electrons are absorbed by the next photosystem, the next set of chlorophyll molecules. Now you see I put the word absorbed kind of in quotations because absorbing maybe isn't the right word to use for electrons, but that's kind of what it looks like if you were to look at it happening in real life. And while this is happening, this movement of electrons is helping us make ATP. How? Well, we already know the process of chemiosmosis. So we already know that chemiosmosis is when hydrogen ions move through this structure and their movement causes ATP to be produced. So this movement of electrons helps push the process of chemiosmosis along. Now, what happens to those original chlorophyll molecules, the ones that lost their electrons? Well, they're unstable. They just lost 2 electrons. They don't like it. So they remove electrons from water molecules. So up here where I said photolysis means water splits, water breaks, or light breaks, and we were talking about water, we're splitting apart a molecule of water. So if I look at a molecule of water, I have an oxygen and I have 2 hydrogens. And so what happens is that this molecule of water gets ripped apart. And we're not just ripping apart one atom from the next, we're actually splitting it a little bit more. The oxygen is going to go off, find another oxygen to pair up with, and diffuse out of the cell. So the oxygen, which is where we get the O2 gas, comes from that molecule of water. Once the water is split apart and 2 molecules of water have been split, then I have 2 O's. I can make a molecule of oxygen, and it can be released through the stomata, which are the little pores on the surface of a leaf. What happens down here with the hydrogen? Now remember I mentioned yesterday that when we say the word proton, a lot of the time we really mean a hydrogen ion, because that's all a hydrogen ion really is. So sometimes, like in the animation I showed you, they just called them protons. I like to call them hydrogen protons, so we're really clear that we're talking about hydrogen here, so that you don't mess up where they came from. But just so you know, in a lot of external literature, they'll just say proton. These hydrogen ions are eventually added to NADP to form NADPH. The other thing that they need are electrons. So remember that NADP actually has a positive charge. So I'm just going to show you how this all adds up. NADP is positive. A hydrogen ion is positive. Since I have 2 things that are positive, I need 2 electrons. That gives me 2 negative things. That's how I get NADPH with no electrical charge. So for me to go from NADP positive to NADPH, no charge, I need those hydrogens, but I also need those 2 electrons. So those 2 electrons really originate from these excited electrons up here. Light hit them, they got excited, they started moving. They went to the next photosystem. Some more electrons got excited. They started moving. But that was the original location that electron movement started. To put those electrons back, we get them from water. The rest of the water, the oxygen and the hydrogen, well, the oxygen leaves and the hydrogen eventually makes NADPH. So we're still talking about photosynthesis here. Remember that photosynthesis basically happens in 2 parts. The first part is where water molecules get used up, oxygen, NADPH, ATP get made. Those are the things that we're producing. The second part, which is what we'll talk about now, this is the part where CO2 becomes a carbohydrate. So that's how we're separating the 2 parts of photosynthesis, so that when we write the reaction overall, we're actually writing 2 smaller sets of reactions put together as one big overall process. So I put the title, Who Needs Light Anyway, because this second part of photosynthesis does not require light. So if we're just saying photosynthesis in general, yeah, you need light for photosynthesis to happen, but only for the first part. For this second part, just like my photo where the sun has set, there's no light, and it's still very beautiful. Well, I guess there's a little bit of light, but the sun has set. And so this second part could theoretically happen at night. The first part has to have happened already for this to continue, but the second part doesn't require additional input of light to occur. So we're going to talk about what the steps are first, and then I'm going to show you the picture that represents this cycle. Now, part 2 is called the light-independent reaction, because like I said, light is not necessarily required. Sometimes, more so in the olden days when I was in school and not now, we would call this the dark reaction. But it's not necessarily true to call it dark because it could happen when the light is out. And so that's why light independent is a bit of a better name. Although it's not unheard of for me to call it the dark reaction because I learned it that way. The name that's often associated with this is the Calvin-Benson cycle. So again, I remind you, if you ever invent something or discover something, name it after yourself. People will have to call it that and for all of eternity. So we could call this the Calvin-Benson cycle as well. Usually when people are talking about this cycle, I found anyways, we usually just say Calvin cycle, not necessarily Calvin-Benson cycle. So what I'm trying to get at is there's a lot of ways to refer to this second part of photosynthesis. As long as you can recognize them all and know which part we're talking about, I'm not going to give you a vocabulary quiz on what all the names are. I just want you to be aware that there's more than one way to refer to it. Now this part occurs in the stroma. So when we're looking at our chloroplast, we have our thylakoid membranes all over the place. And then we have this space, the fluid in between, that is the stroma. That is where this part is happening. Now in this reaction, what's really happening is carbon fixation. So I mentioned already that this is the part where CO2, carbon dioxide, becomes a carbohydrate. And the word fixed doesn't mean like it was broken and I repaired it. It really means was reacted somehow so that it could become this other type of molecule. So it's happening in the stroma, and the main idea is that CO2 enters this cycle and carbohydrates are what are produced. Now here's something that's really important. NADPH, which I just made in the first part of photosynthesis, moves into the stroma from the thylakoid membranes and releases hydrogen. Now that's really helpful because if you recall, carbohydrates are made out of C and H and O, and carbon dioxide only has C and O. There have to be H's that come from somewhere. So NADPH move into the stroma and release their hydrogen protons. Now there are other substances around. We are not going to focus on the names of every single molecule in the cycle, but the idea is that the hydrogen combines with the CO2, some fancy reactions happen, and I get a carbohydrate. Now the other thing that's really important is that I made some ATP in that first part of photosynthesis, and I'm going to use this ATP for energy. So chemical reactions don't just happen. Stuff has to happen to make them start. You might remember that I said that in the enzyme section, all reactions have an activation energy, what they need to get them going. And so for this reaction to happen, I'm going to use that ATP, that I made during the first part of photosynthesis. I'm going to break it down to ADP and a phosphate, releasing the energy in that high energy phosphate bond. Now, just because I'm going to show you this in a minute, I'm just going to tell you now. It takes 6 NADPHs and 9 ATPs for the Calvin-Benson cycle to work. That's how many of them there are. Now I'm going to show you a picture next, and I'm going to talk about which parts of the picture I need you to know the specific names of. So instead of trying rapidly to copy every single word down, maybe follow along with me, because I'll circle the parts that you need to know. If there's a name that you need to know, I'll highlight it, because I want to show you what it looks like when this cycle is happening, and then I'm going to show you a little animation of the molecules actually doing this. Now, before I do that, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask about the basic idea about the light-independent reaction? All right, so here comes the picture, and I'm going to focus on a few things. At the top here, it says there are 3 molecules of CO2. And then next to CO2, it says 1C. This means that there is 1 carbon in each of them. And so what I'm really going to do is count how many carbons there are, rather than necessarily make you know the names of all of these molecules. Now, this says 3 molecules of CO2. If you recall, in the reaction for photosynthesis, there are 6 CO2s. So the first thing I'm going to say is that this happens twice. Every time photosynthesis happens and we get 1 molecule of glucose, this has to happen twice. So I'm going to show you what it looks like when it happens once, and we'll just keep in mind that this would happen 2 times. So you absolutely need to know that CO2 enters the cycle. So I would expect you to know that 3 CO2s enter. I would expect you to know that the formula for carbon dioxide is CO2, and that that means there is 1 carbon. So you need to know what CO2 is. Now, since it's a cycle, there's not really a beginning and an end, but I always like to start at the point where CO2 enters. So we'll call that the beginning, even though there really isn't a beginning and an end. Now, there's a molecule over here. It has a really long name. We're going to abbreviate it RuBP. Its actual name is ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, which I don't need you to say. RuBP is the acceptor. It's the thing that is going to welcome CO2 into the cycle, be its little buddy. If you notice, it says there are 3 molecules. Each molecule has 5 carbons. So that means I had 15 carbons hanging out. 3 more carbons came in. If I add 15 plus 3, that makes 18 carbons. So once these 2 things join, CO2 comes in, and RuBP accepts it, I get a molecule whose name I'm not super interested that you know or that you can repeat, but I get a molecule called 3-phosphoglycerate. There are 6 of them, and each of them have 3 carbons. So see how I have 18 carbons. So all that happened there was my molecules rearranged themselves. I still have the same number of carbons, but instead of 3 big molecules, now I have 6 smaller ones. Now notice over here, there's the first spot that some ATP is being used. What's actually happening here is that I'm taking ATP and I'm making ADP. That means the third phosphate is being broken off and I am getting energy. So the point of using that ATP is that I need some energy. I get some molecules. If you notice, there are 6 that have 3 carbons, so I still have 6 times 3. I don't need you to know the name of this intermediate compound. I'm just keeping track of how many carbons there are. The next step is to use 6 NADPHs and to get 6 NADP after that. So over here, let's write the word oxidize. I am oxidizing NADPH. It had a hydrogen, I'm taking it away. If NADPH is being oxidized, that means my compounds are being reduced. So remember, they always have to happen together. NADPH is getting oxidized, my carbon compounds are getting reduced. In our case, in all the times we're going to talk about reduction, this always means hydrogen is getting added on. So now, I still have 6 molecules that each have 3 carbons. Now these molecules are one of the places that I'd like you to know at least an abbreviation. It's called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. We're going to call it G3P. Sometimes it's also called PGAL because it can become an acid. I'll try to refer to it only as G3P since that's the one that's pictured here. But that name is important because that's the molecule that's actually going to leave. So if you look over here, there were 6 of them. Each of them had 3 carbons. Now the next step is that one of those molecules of that same substance, G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, leaves. And the other 5 remain. So one of those G3P molecules leaves. It has 3 carbons. So I'm back to having 15 carbons in my cycle. I took 3 of them out. So you'll notice that it's like these 3 carbons from carbon dioxide just got some stuff added to them and then came right back out. Now what happens to the stuff that stays in the cycle? Well, some changes occur. I don't need you to know the intermediate compound names. But the idea is that I'm going to get my RuBP back by using 3 more ATP for energy. So I mentioned right before we started that there were 9 ATPs. Here's 3 ATP. Here's 6 ATP. Together, that makes 9. So 9 of them need to be used every time this cycle happens. Now down at the bottom, my product, that one molecule of G3P, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, can be combined with another molecule of G3P to make glucose. So if I do this twice, I get 1 molecule of glucose.